Um, Thank you everybody for coming on this ungodly time. No, thank you for coming to see us see this presentation. So this is very much a preliminary thought process. So we're still in the midst of data collection, and what I'm presenting is part of a decent work and city project, which is run by Matt Johnson, where we're trying to understand what makes decent work across 6 different cities. So originally I was going to look at 3 cities, but I haven't done the data collection for the other 3 cities, and I'm in the process of collecting data for 2 cities. But I've got something, I'm trying to work out what the core ideas are. So I'm just going to present some of them to you today and kind of see what you think. So today we're going to look at childcare, and I'll explain why. As I said earlier, today is an opportunity to test out some ideas. So when we started off the project, we were doing focus groups with women across Greater Manchester to find out what they thought decent work meant. And very early became clear to us that actually childcare was a key enabler for people to access decent work, but in itself was a key provider of work to women as well. So today I'm going to focus on 2 cases, one of Montreal and one of Manchester. And I'm going to show to you how childcare is kind of created, but also how childcare is in crisis and the different movements that are occurring to overcome this childcare crisis. And I'm trying to kind of understand, to understand the forms of coalitions that are being built, and also understand whether these are feminist movements or whether these are movements of social reproduction, or whether these are just movements against austerity. So I'm just going to talk to you about 2 very, very different movements and 2 very, very different childcare systems and how these kind of have come about. So the reason why this is also of interest is that Fudge and Mudluck recently published a paper where they said actually to overcome labour market segmentation and to allow for good, decent work, you really do need to allow for universal public childcare to enable everybody to have access to the same kind of opportunities. Black, in his excellent book, recently said that we are in a dual crisis of social reproduction, one in which we both have poor working conditions. Poor working class families lack access to good quality childcare, but on the other side, we have bad employment conditions within these sectors. So these are kind of where I'm sat and trying to have a look at the data that we're able to kind of collect at the moment. So we are still in the field, as I said. We have been conducting interviews. We have conducted some interviews in Bremen as well, but I'm going to talk about Manchester and Montreal. So we've conducted key informant interviews in both these cities with trade unionists, key civil society actors, and people within local authorities, childcare providers. But we're going to go back and kind of try to do some interviews with key organizations and some focus groups of workers to kind of understand what is going on within these sectors. So to give you a bit of a look at what does childcare look like in both these areas, within Montreal and especially Quebec, there is the idealized Quebec model where you pay $8.75 a day for your children to access childcare, and with these are unionized workplaces with relatively good conditions of employment. Within Manchester, on the other hand, it's all run and owned by the private market, with 88% of children going to private nurseries. And what you have to pay once your child is 3, you have access to 15 hours paid childcare. But if you are a wealthier family, you might have access to 30. But the thing is that the wraparound costs are so expensive, and that quite a few families actually struggle to either pay the upfront cost before going to childcare, or they also just are unable to actually pay for it. On the other hand, the conditions of employment is really, really, really bad. In Montreal, while this CPE model exists of idealized childcare, only 46% of children who have access to childcare in the first place, only 30% go to CPE, which is quite low. The rest of them are going to either childcare providers or they are going to the privatized market. And again, within the privatized market, as within Manchester, conditions of employment are not very good, and the workers are ununionized, And it can cost up to $70 a day to send your children to this sector. But overall, there's a massive shortage. So what is kind of happening is that we are realizing that we are in a crisis in both cities, but the ways in which these crises look like is slightly different. So in Quebec, there's not enough spaces. There's a chronic lack of educators who are unwilling to kind of access employment. And even though Quebec government has started to kind of do things in order to get more people trained, people just don't really want to work in the sector. It's long hours, conditions of employment, even though they're better comparatively to the private sector, aren't necessarily that great. In Manchester, again, or in the UK, there's Manchester, there's 90% sufficiency, which means that there's enough places for 90% of the children, but this is not necessarily in the right areas, right? So in wealthy areas, there's plenty of provision. In poorer areas, there's less provision, but also people are not really happy to necessarily send their children to childcare, or due to, in some cases, having to pay upfront the cost of childcare, they're kind of unable to access it. And on the other hand, it's really expensive. But there is also a massive deficit for childcare providers because the state is not providing enough to the private sector to let alone make a profit. So there is also quite a few providers closing down. So what is being done in these cities to kind of overcome this crisis? Let's start with Montreal. So within Montreal, the Quebec case kind of stems from a history of a socialist feminist movement. Within 1997, the creation of the childcare, the Family Act, I think it is, whereby CPA kind of became like this model, and Montreal or Quebec is seen as this utopia where gender equality has kind of been enabled because everybody has access, or supposedly should have access to childcare. But it is actually it is in crisis. There's not enough places, there's not enough access for people, and there's not enough staff. So following COVID-19, people realized what it meant to look after your own children. So a movement appeared, and this is a really interesting movement because this is parents, consists of parents, non-unionized workers, and trade unions. And we started doing interviews with them, and the parents started this massive Facebook campaign, and a further campaign. Is it halfway? Okay, fine. Parents started this Facebook campaign, and a campaign not only to kind of fight for extra places, but they became aware that actually we also need to fight for better employment conditions for the staff. And the non-unionized workers, which were, they deliberately said they were non-unionized workers, but actually turns out there were union members as part of this campaign group, were fighting for better conditions because they realized that even within the CPAs, there was increased work intensification as they had to work longer hours, as there was more requirement to look after children with disabilities, and because they had to sign more things out. Anyway, so the trade union found out that these movements were happening. These were really, really strong movements. And together with these movements, they started to run a campaign. And each one of these groups was given their own thing to kind of fight for. It's interesting talking to the trade union because the trade union has a very different understanding of the campaign to, for example, the non-unionized workers movement, who don't necessarily understand are a bit dubious of the role of the trade union within the whole thing. But it's really, really interesting kind of discussion, and lots of passion, and lots of discussion about why this is a feminized movement. So between September 2021, they went on strike. The strike, and then they went on a few more strikes, and in December, the 3rd of end of December, they kind of got a really relatively good outcome. But what was really interesting about this campaign was that they weren't going to step down until everybody got a pay rise. So originally the state said, okay, we'll give educators a pay rise. And the unions said, well, no, we can't just give the educators a pay rise. What about the cooks? What about the cleaners? What about the office staff and all the auxiliary members? So they refused to go off strike until everybody had received some kind of pay rise. And also until other things were won, such as improvements to annual leave, improvements to being given time to do extra tasks, such as filling out assessments for children, which was a legal requirement. And so it was really interesting because they kind of went on strike together, and all of a sudden was the first time, this is what the unions and the parents said, that they were working together there in collaboration, because COVID made parents realize, and general public realize how important childcare workers were to keeping the Montreal economy going during the COVID-19. So they worked together and had a lot of positive support from the media as well, which they said was very unusual. So that's really interesting, that it was all around the notion of feminization, being a feminist movement. And now after the movement, they're still fighting separately, but they've set the sporadic parent movement and a sporadic non-unionized workers movement have now set up as advocacy groups, which is really interesting, as they still are fighting for better gender equality. Okay, Manchester, what happened? In Manchester, there was the only place that still had a public, well, a local authority run nursery was Salford. All the other ones have closed down. Salford is a small little town within Manchester. And in 2018, the local authority said, we are going to close all of these nurseries. We're going to close all 5 nurseries. These nurseries are unionized. These nurseries provide a high level of care, especially for children in deprived areas and with disabilities. And they said they're going to close them. And what was really interesting was that the union told the parents and told the workers that this was going to happen. And they caused this huge rally. Over 1,000 people turned up to this rally, and there was massive public support from the whole community. And because of this support, they went down to the parliament to say, can you please pay for it? Because it's actually centralized in Westminster, not the local authority. And they said, no, we can't do it. But what was interesting was the elected officials, such as the mayor, were on side of came on side with this movement and became part of this movement. And what they said in 2019, they tried to see if they could outsource these nurseries, and they found that nobody would provide adequate levels of employment or adequate levels of care to be able to actually run these nurseries. So what happened was that Salford's local authority said, fine, we will prioritize the nurseries. We will not close these nurseries because they're so core to the community, and we'll keep them running. So that, and they will subsidize it. And I think they said something like it's £20,000 a year that they have to pay extra to one nursery to kind of keep it going. So it's really expensive. That's fine. But it kind of kept it going. And what was really interesting is that this campaign itself affected the way in which organizing is happening at this local level. So now every time they want to close women's aid centers, every time they want to close anything, it is the community comes together and has massive rallies, but also the relationship that exists between the unions and the local officials has changed. The local officials are now sitting on meetings with the unions, and the unions are sitting in meetings with the local officials. And there is a much better collaborative relationship happening between the two, and the parents groups as well. But they're no longer talking about childcare issues. It's much more a discussion of public services. So therefore, I come to my conclusion. Where are we now? How should we see these movements? How should we see this crisis of childcare provision, but also how should we see the movements to kind of overcome them? Should we look at should we be using Tatterstall's really important notions of coalition building? But there weren't really any bridge builders in Montreal, really. We didn't have one individual who was creating those discussions, but different individuals that were having different discussions, and they still don't quite like each other. They just like the cause. So that is a really interesting way to kind of think of it. But is Montreal a feminist movement? Because there is discussions of this is an issue of gender equality and labor equality. But what is Manchester then? Because there was no discussion of conditions of employment. The only thing that was being discussed was we can't close these services down because they're important to our community. So the discussion is much more about community and austerity. So like, how should we talk about this? Are these actually struggles of social reproduction, or are these feminist struggles? Are these struggles for closure and austerity, or what are they? So this is kind of what we're kind of in the process of thinking. And yeah, thank you very much.